The penthouse ballroom shimmered under the glow of crystal chandeliers. The clinking of glasses blended with the lively chatter and laughter that echoed through the luxurious space. Ethan Carter, a feared name in the business world, was, as always, surrounded by investors and socialites. But that night he barely heard what they were saying. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Ryan, his longtime friend, but also his most dangerous rival when it came to games of ego. "Ethan, you might be good at a lot of things, but do you know what your problem is?" Ryan said, swirling the amber liquid in his whiskey glass. "Enlighten me." Ethan arched an eyebrow, bored, as he took a sip of his drink. "You only play to win, never to feel." Ryan leaned in slightly, narrowing his eyes. "I'd bet you could never maintain a real relationship." Ethan let out a short laugh. "That's not a bet, that's an insult." "Then prove me wrong." Ryan's smile widened, mischievous. "I'll choose a woman for you to marry. If you stay married to her for 6 months, I'll pay you $1 million. The challenge silenced the buzz around them. A few people nearby turned to watch, intrigued. Ethan felt his heart pick up speed. He never backed down from a challenge, not when it involved money and, more importantly, his pride. 6 months? Easy. He leaned back into the leather armchair with a smirk. "Who's the lucky one?" Ryan held his gaze and made a subtle gesture toward someone across the room. Ethan followed his eyes and then saw Olivia. She stood near the balcony, holding a glass of wine, seemingly indifferent to the conversations and extravagance around her. Her simple yet elegant dress made her stand out precisely because of its understated nature. Her hair was tied back practically, and her sharp eyes revealed a woman accustomed to independence. Ethan frowned. She didn't fit in here. She didn't fit with him. "Not your type, is she?" Ryan teased. Ethan smirked, but his stomach tightened. "That just makes it more interesting." 2 days later, Ethan received Olivia's contact information. It wasn't a chance encounter, nor a spontaneous conversation. Ryan had spoken to her first, laid out the proposal. Their meeting was set in a discreet restaurant. Ethan arrived first, as he always did for business meetings. When Olivia walked in, he was surprised to see she neither hesitated nor looked the least bit impressed. She sat across from him, folded her hands on the table, and got straight to the point. "So, how exactly do you plan to convince me to go along with this madness?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. He had expected resistance, but he hadn't expected her to take the lead so quickly. "You agreed to meet with me, so something tells me you're considering it." She tilted her head slightly. "Consider it just curiosity." "And what else do you want besides satisfying that?" Olivia studied him for a moment before answering. "Do you know the difference between us, Ethan? You see this bet as a game. I see it as an opportunity." He smiled, intrigued. "An opportunity for what?" "To see how far a man like you is willing to go to win." Ethan felt a spark of something he couldn't name. This woman wasn't predictable. "So you're already studying me, and you're already trying to win me over." She took a sip of her wine, not breaking eye contact. There was a subtext in their words. Ethan wasn't sure if he was being drawn in or challenged, but for the first time he felt this game might not be so simple. The waiter interrupted the silence to bring their meals, but the tension between them had already been set. Ethan leaned slightly forward, fingers drumming on the table. "Let's say you accept. How do you want to play this?" Olivia gave him a sly smile. "Oh, Ethan, haven't you realized yet? We're already playing." His response caught in his throat. He had always been in control, but for the first time, he felt like maybe he wasn't the one pulling the strings, and that unsettled him. Later that night, Ethan gazed at the city from his luxurious apartment. His phone vibrated beside him, a message from Ryan. Still want to back out? This is your last chance. Ethan clenched his jaw and typed his reply without hesitation. This hasn't even started yet. He wouldn't lose. He never lost. But then why did it feel like he was stepping into unknown territory? And worse, why did it feel like Olivia knew that before he even realized it himself? Ethan adjusted the golden cufflinks on his suit and stared at himself in the mirror. His reflection was flawless, as always. Expressionless face, sharp eyes, the upright posture of a man who never hesitated. That's how he liked to be seen. But something about this morning felt different. He wasn't heading into a business merger or a multi-million-dollar negotiation. He was heading to his wedding, to a woman who didn't love him, and to his growing frustration, one he still couldn't quite figure out. The wedding was emotionless. A small ceremony, no photographers, no important guests besides Ryan, who watched it all with a satisfied smile. Olivia arrived on time, without a lavish wedding dress, without tears. She looked calm, as if she was signing just another contract. When it was time for the vows, Ethan kept his tone practical. 6 months, not a day more, he whispered as he slid the cold ring onto her finger. Not a day less, Olivia replied in the same tone, looking straight into his eyes. And for a brief second, Ethan felt something in her voice beyond sarcasm, something he couldn't quite name. That night, he opened the door to his apartment and gestured for her to step inside. "Welcome to your new home." She scanned the place with a neutral expression. The panoramic windows displayed the most exclusive city view. Imported designer furniture, million-dollar artwork, the subtle scent of leather and wood, everything meticulously arranged to impress. But Olivia merely glanced around as if visiting a hotel. "You don't seem impressed," Ethan noted, leaning against the door. "Were you hoping I would be?" He let out a low chuckle. "Normally they are." She turned to face him. "Then maybe it's time you ask yourself why this seems so irrelevant to me." Ethan watched her for a long moment. He was certain no woman could resist what he had to offer. Luxury, influence, power, and yet there stood Olivia, fearless, unimpressed, and he hated to admit it, but that unsettled him. The first days of marriage were a silent game of resistance. Ethan kept testing Olivia's limits. She stood her ground. "I made a reservation at the best restaurant in the city for dinner tonight," he announced casually one afternoon. "Good. Luck. Hope you enjoy it." He raised an eyebrow. "Was that a no?" "That was an I already have plans." Ethan chuckled, but there was no humor in his smile. "You really make a point of challenging me, don't you?" She met his gaze without hesitation. "And you really make a point of underestimating me." A heavy silence settled between them. Ethan felt something shift inside him. It wasn't anger nor frustration. It was something else. And he wasn't sure he was ready to admit what it was. That night he was in his private office, going through contracts, when he heard light footsteps behind him. Olivia walked in without knocking, as if she had already decided she didn't owe him any explanations. "You've done a good job with that," she said, pointing at the open bottle of wine on his desk. "I bet you didn't even realize you're drinking alone." Ethan studied her, trying to decipher her meaning. "Don't you find it strange?" Olivia continued, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. "You can have everything, but at the end of the day, what do you really have?" Ethan kept his posture firm, but her question lingered in the air. What did he really have? "What do you want from me, Olivia?" he asked, breaking the silence. She gave him a small smile, but there was something enigmatic in her eyes. "That's the wrong question." He frowned. "Then what's the right one?" She leaned in slightly, as if she wanted him to really listen. "What do you want from yourself, Ethan?" The question hung between them, and for the first time he realized he might be about to discover an answer he had never wanted to face. Ethan swirled the whiskey in his glass, staring at the amber liquid as if it held the answer to Olivia's question. "What do you want from yourself, Ethan?" He hated to admit it, but those words refused to leave his mind. He had always known what he wanted: money, power, respect. But now, sitting in his office with the city lights glowing outside for the first time, he felt an unfamiliar discomfort. He hated that feeling. The next morning, Olivia left early. No explanation, no courtesy. Ethan noticed because, for the first time in years, he woke up in an apartment that wasn't perfectly arranged to his liking. The sheets on her side of the bed were still messy. Her scent lingered on the pillow. He frowned. What the hell is happening to me? It wasn't like he cared. So why did he find himself checking the time, counting how long she had been gone? When Olivia returned, Ethan was sitting on the couch, reading the newspaper, or at least pretending to. She walked into the apartment carrying a shopping bag. Dressed in simple clothes, nothing about her hinted that she was married to one of the richest men in the city. "Where were you?" Ethan asked, not taking his eyes off the pages in front of him. "Since when do I need to report my schedule?" She shot back, setting the bag down on the counter. Ethan slowly folded the newspaper and stood up. "It's not about reporting, but we are married. In a rather peculiar way, don't you think? Even so, it would be polite to let me know where you go." Olivia let out a short, ironic laugh. "Are you used to women asking for permission, Ethan?" Dickon, he crossed his arms, feeling an unfamiliar heat rise in his chest. "I'm used to clear agreements, and so far, you seem to be ignoring the fact that we're in this together." She stepped closer, her gaze holding something challenging. "Are you looking for a real marriage now, Ethan?" she teased. "Because if that's the case, I'd love to know when exactly you started believing in that." Ethan clenched his jaw. She was playing with him, and the worst part, he couldn't win. Over the next few days, the tension only grew. Ethan tried to keep up his usual composure, to ignore the unsettling presence Olivia had brought into his life. But she wasn't like the other women he had known. She didn't accept the expensive gifts he left on the table. She wasn't impressed by exclusive restaurant reservations, and most of all, she didn't show the slightest sign of giving in to his world. "You're playing a dangerous game, Olivia," he murmured one night as they ate dinner in the kitchen, the silence between them heavy. "And what game would that be? Pretending none of this matters to you?" She smirked. "You think I'm pretending?" Ethan didn't answer, because deep down he didn't know. But there was something about the way she looked at him, as if she knew something he didn't, and that unsettled him. One morning, Ethan woke up earlier than usual. Olivia's side of the bed was empty. He walked to the living room and found her sitting on the balcony, drinking coffee, gazing at the city. She didn't seem to notice him there. Or if she did, she didn't care. For a moment, he just watched. She looked so distant from all of this, so detached from the life she was now a part of. Then suddenly, she broke the silence. "Have you ever stopped to think that maybe money doesn't solve everything?" Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" She turned her head slowly, locking eyes with him. "You're a man who has always had everything, always bought what you wanted, but what if one day you can't buy something?" He gave her a crooked smile. "I always find a way." "And what if you don't?" she pressed. Ethan felt a strange tightness in his chest. He had never considered that possibility, but now, standing in front of this woman he couldn't predict, he realized he might already be facing it. And for the first time, he didn't know how to win. The silence that followed Olivia's question hung in the air, like a thread about to snap. Ethan was not a man accustomed to hesitation, but there, standing in front of a woman who challenged him with every look and every word, he found himself at a loss for an answer, and that irritated him deeply. "You're making the wrong assumption," he said, leaning against the balcony door. There's always a way out. There's always a way to win. Olivia smiled, and that smile, so calm, so provoking, made him feel as if he was stepping onto far more treacherous ground than he had imagined. "Who said you're winning?" The days that followed became a silent dance between them. For then, the first time in his life, Ethan couldn't predict someone's next move. Olivia showed no interest in his money, but she also didn't play the role of an indifferent wife. She was always there, present, but untouchable, and that started to unsettle him in a way he didn't understand. At a formal dinner he hosted for investors, she arrived wearing a simple dress, no extravagant jewelry, and yet she caught more attention than any other woman in the room. People weren't looking at her because of luxury, but because she seemed entirely in control of herself. Ethan watched from a distance, whiskey in hand, feeling something dangerous stir inside him. He wanted to understand what made her so different, and at the same time, he wanted to break through that resistance. That night, when they returned to the apartment, the silence between them was heavy. Olivia slipped off her shoes with a quiet sigh and walked past him without hurry, heading straight to the kitchen for a glass of water. Ethan followed, stopping in the doorway. "Did you enjoy the event?" "It was interesting," she replied, emotionless. "You seemed to be having fun." She took a sip before answering. "And you seemed bothered." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Why would I be bothered?" She placed the glass in the sink and turned to face him. "Because you don't like not being in control." The look she gave him was sharp, piercing. Ethan felt something shift inside him, a discomfort he didn't recognize. She was right, and he hated that. Over the next few days, Ethan started testing Olivia's limits. He rearranged his schedule without telling her, cancelled plans she had made, tried to force her to adjust to his pace, but she didn't bend, and the worst part, she seemed to know exactly what he was doing. "Are you trying to wear me down, Ethan?" she asked one day, crossing her arms as he changed her schedule for the third time without consulting her. He didn't answer right away. He just studied her, trying to gauge how far she would go. "I just think that as my wife, you should consider my time as well." "Funny," she said with a small smirk. "Because I think you should consider that I'm not a piece on your chessboard." Ethan frowned. She continued, "You can try to control me. Move the pieces however you like, but I'm not one of them." She stepped closer, eyes locked on his. "And believe me, Ethan, if you keep playing this way, you'll realize I'm much better at this game than you think." Ethan felt something inside him waver. He was used to being the hunter, but for the first time he had the terrible feeling that he was becoming the prey. The penthouse door clicked shut behind Ethan with a sharp snap. He tossed his keys onto the marble table and let out a long sigh. That woman was challenging every instinct he had. He had always known how to play the game, how to manipulate, anticipate, and steer situations in his favor. But Olivia, she didn't just resist. She played right back, and the worst part, she seemed to be enjoying it. The next morning, when Ethan came downstairs for breakfast, he found Olivia sitting at the kitchen counter, reading a book as if she were completely alone in the world. Slowly, she took a sip of her coffee, not sparing him a glance. "You're not even going to pretend you noticed me?" Ethan asked, pulling out a chair. "I noticed your presence. I just don't see the need to react to it." He chuckled, but there was a hint of frustration in his tone. "You're an interesting woman, Olivia. And you're a predictable man, Ethan." The reply was swift, precise, no hesitation. Ethan clenched his jaw. He wasn't used to this kind of resistance. And what irritated him the most was that instead of pushing him away, it only made him want to unravel her even more. In the days that followed, the silent war between them intensified. Ethan started testing Olivia more directly. He casually scheduled business dinners without consulting her, brought home expensive gifts she never asked for, tried to pull her into his world, expecting that eventually she would give in. But Olivia never did. If he tried to manipulate her, she would just smirk, as if she knew exactly what he was doing. "You have a pattern, Ethan," she remarked one evening, lounging on the couch while he poured 2 glasses of wine. "And what would that be?" "You stack offers on people, waiting for them to accept. And when they don't, you push until they do." She took a sip of wine, holding his gaze without wavering. "But there's something you still haven't figured out." Ethan frowned. "What's that?" She leaned forward slightly, her eyes glinting with a silent challenge. "I never give in." A chill ran down Ethan's spine, and in that moment, he realized something dangerous. He didn't just want to win against her, he wanted to understand her, and that was something he had never felt before. One night, after a stressful meeting, Ethan returned home later than usual. When he walked into the penthouse, he found Olivia sitting on the balcony, staring at the city lights. He hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. "You don't sleep early. You don't realize you always try to start a conversation as if nothing is happening," she replied, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. Ethan narrowed his eyes. "What's that supposed to mean?" Olivia let out a quiet sigh before turning her head to face him. "It means you pretend this marriage is just a simple game. But you're starting to feel otherwise." Ethan's heart skipped, just a fraction, but enough for him to notice. He hated the feeling of being read so easily. "Don't be presumptuous. And you don't be a coward," she shot back, her voice just as steady. Ethan swallowed hard. The silent war between them was no longer just a game of power. It was something deeper, something far more dangerous. And for the first time, Ethan started to wonder if he was still the one in control. The silence between them was no longer just an absence of words. It was a pulsing tension, something that vibrated in the air every time they were in the same room. Ethan had always known how to manipulate situations in his favor, but Olivia didn't play by the same rules, and that was starting to get to him. The next morning, when Ethan came downstairs for breakfast, Olivia was already in the kitchen. She was wearing a loose shirt, probably one of his, and sipping her coffee calmly, eyes focused on her phone screen. She didn't even look up when he entered, and that irritated him. "I'm your husband," he said, grabbing a coffee mug. Olivia finally lifted her gaze, but her expression remained neutral. "And I'm your wife. Is there a point to this?" He leaned against the counter, studying her. "Married couples usually talk in the morning." She took another sip of her coffee before responding. "Married couples usually marry for love." Ethan let out a humorless chuckle. "You always have a comeback, don't you? Does that bother you?" His grip on the mug tightened slightly, more than necessary. "It fascinates me." For a brief second, something flickered in Olivia's eyes, but she looked away before he could figure out what it meant. In the days that followed, Ethan found himself noticing things he never had before. The way Olivia furrowed her brows when she was concentrating on something she read. The quiet sound of her laugh when watching a video on her phone. The way she avoided staying in the same room with him for too long, as if she was escaping, as if she was protecting herself, and that bothered him more than it should. One night, as he was reviewing contracts in his office, he heard the door open. Olivia walked in without hesitation, arms crossed, her gaze sharp. "Are you trying to control me, Ethan?" He slowly closed the folder in front of him, tilting his head slightly. "If I were, you would have noticed by now." "Oh, I've noticed," she shot back without hesitation. A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "Then why are you still here?" She was silent for a few seconds. Then, with a calmness that made something inside him tighten, she said, "Because as much as you try to manipulate me, Ethan, deep down, you know you can't." The air between them thickened. She was right. He might be a master at power plays, but with Olivia, he was playing and losing at the same time. Later that night, as he stared out at the city from the apartment window, Ethan found himself thinking about something he had never considered before. What if, for the first time, the game wasn't about winning? What if, this time, it was about understanding, but understanding what? He shut his eyes, frustrated. He hated not having the answers, but with Olivia, maybe he never would. Ethan had never known how to deal with uncertainty. His life had always been defined by quick, precise, calculated decisions. But with Olivia, the certainties he had always relied on were crumbling, and the worst part, he couldn't pinpoint when it had started happening. The next morning, as he left the bedroom, he found Olivia in the kitchen, dressed in a light blouse and jeans, making coffee. The scene should have been ordinary, but it wasn't. She moved with quiet ease, completely unaffected by his presence, as if this marriage, this apartment, and everything it represented were just passing circumstances, and that unsettled him. "You always wake up this early?" he asked, leaning against the counter. "Old habits," she replied, without looking at him. He watched her for a few moments. "You used to have a completely different routine from the one you have now." "And you think that bothers me?" She raised an eyebrow. Ethan gripped his coffee cup a little tighter. "I don't know. You tell me." She let out a soft chuckle and finally met his gaze. "Are you starting to analyze me, Ethan?" He gave her a crooked smile. "Maybe." She tilted her head slightly, as if considering something. "Careful. You might not like what you find." A shiver ran down Ethan's spine, because for the first time he had the distinct feeling that Olivia was hiding something. And worse than that, maybe he wanted to find out. In the days that followed, Ethan realized his obsession was growing. He tried to convince himself he still controlled the game, but every time he watched Olivia, every little detail about her felt like a puzzle he couldn't solve. She refused to fit into the mold he expected. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't demand anything, and yet she always seemed 2 steps ahead, as if she knew something he didn't. One night, when Ethan returned from a business dinner, he found Olivia sitting on the balcony, as she often did. The wind played with her hair, and she seemed lost in distant thoughts. He hesitated before stepping closer. "You've always liked watching the city." She turned her head slightly and smirked. "It's not the city I'm watching." Ethan frowned. Then what? Olivia took a sip of wine before answering. The silence. A strange tightness formed in his chest, and before he could stop himself, the question slipped out. "What are you running from, Olivia?" Her smile faded. She looked at him for long seconds, as if deciding something, and then, in a quiet murmur, she said, "What if the real question is, what am I waiting for?" The tension in the air thickened. Ethan didn't know what she meant by that, but for the first time, he realized this marriage was far more than just a game, and maybe, just maybe, Olivia had entered it with a purpose he had yet to understand. Olivia's words lingered in the air like an unsolved riddle. What if the real question is, what am I waiting for? Ethan replayed those words in his mind countless times over the following days. He tried to ignore them, to go about his routine as if they meant nothing. But the truth was undeniable. He was obsessed with figuring out what she meant, because for the first time he felt like something much bigger was happening, something he still couldn't see. That night, Ethan arrived home later than usual. A business dinner had stretched on longer than expected, but unlike most nights, his mind wasn't occupied with numbers and contracts. He was thinking about her, about what Olivia was hiding, about what she wasn't saying. When he stepped into the penthouse, the apartment was silent. He walked slowly toward the living room and found her sitting on the couch, legs folded beneath her, eyes fixed on a book. She didn't even look up when he entered. "You're not going to ask where I was?" Ethan teased, tossing his keys onto the coffee table. "Do you want me to ask?" He let out a quiet chuckle. "You never act like a wife." Olivia closed the book slowly and finally met his gaze. "And since when have you wanted a wife, Ethan?" He opened his mouth to reply, but nothing came out, because in that moment he realized he had never actually thought about it before. He had always had women around him, but never someone who was truly by his side. And Olivia, she didn't seem to care about being. Or maybe she already was. Just in a way he still didn't understand. In the days that followed, Ethan began watching Olivia differently. The little details he once overlooked started standing out. The way she remained silent but always seemed to be listening. The way she moved through the apartment, not with indifference, but with precision. The way she never asked about his business, yet somehow always seemed to know more than she let on. And then, one night, he caught her looking at his office. Standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable, he walked toward her slowly. "You never come in here." She blinked, as if shaking off a momentary trance. "I was never invited," Ethan smirked. "Since when do you need an invitation for anything?" She hesitated, and in that instant, he knew. There was something in that office she wanted to see, something that mattered to her. But what? A dangerous thrill shot through Ethan's veins. He had the distinct feeling that he was close to an answer. But was he ready for it? Ethan knew how to read signs. It was what made him an unbeatable negotiator. He could tell when someone was lying, when they were hiding something, when they wanted something but refused to say it. And Olivia, she was hiding something. The way she looked. At his office, the subtle hesitation before answering, the quick glance toward the slightly open door. She wanted to go in there, but she didn't want him to notice, and that made Ethan's blood burn. He didn't like secrets, at least not when he was the one being deceived. That night he watched Olivia from a distance. She ate dinner slowly, as if nothing was wrong. Then she retreated to the bedroom, leaving the door slightly ajar. Ethan stayed in the living room for a while, pretending to be distracted, but deep down he was waiting to see what would happen. And then, minutes later, he heard it. Soft footsteps in the hallway, and the quiet creak of his office door opening. Ethan rose silently. He walked down the hallway, careful not to let his footsteps echo against the marble floor. When he reached the door, he saw her. Olivia stood in front of the bookshelf, her fingers gliding over the leather spines. She didn't look lost or curious. She looked like she was searching for something specific. Ethan crossed his arms and leaned against the doorway, his voice low and firm. "Looking for something?" Olivia froze. Slowly, she turned to face him, her eyes flashing with defiance, but this time he saw something else, something that hadn't been there before, a flicker of nervousness. She took a deep breath and smiled. "I just wanted to know what you keep in here." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "And did you find what you were looking for?" She held his gaze for a moment. Then calmly, she took a step back. "Not yet." A sharp thrill shot down Ethan's spine. She didn't deny it. She didn't pretend. She didn't make up an excuse. She admitted, without saying the exact words, that she was after something. And in that moment, he knew. The truth was closer than he had imagined. And for the first time, Ethan felt that maybe he wasn't the one in control of this game. Ethan closed the office door behind him slowly, letting the sound echo through the room. Olivia's gaze didn't waver, but he noticed the tension. In her shoulders, she was hiding something, and now he was certain he needed to find out what it was. "Come on, Olivia." He walked slowly toward the bookshelf, his eyes scanning every book, every file, every object on the desk. You came in here looking for something. What was it? She crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. You always think everything revolves around you, don't you? Ethan let out a quiet chuckle, though there was no humor in his eyes, because most of the time it does. She narrowed her eyes. Maybe it's time you realize that not everything can be bought, negotiated, or manipulated. He took another step forward, tilting his head slightly. And what if I say, I want to play your game now? For a brief second, a flicker of hesitation crossed Olivia's face. Ethan saw it, and that was all he needed to know. He was close to something important. In the following days, the air between them shifted. Olivia was more alert, but so was Ethan. He started paying attention to every move she made, every sudden departure, every glance toward the office when she thought he wasn't looking. She was waiting for the right moment to go back, and this time Ethan decided he would let her. He just needed to see what would happen. One night, Ethan staged his own exit. He grabbed his car keys, sent a few voice messages out loud. Just enough for Olivia to hear, and then walked out the front door. But he didn't leave. From inside his car, parked in the darkened street, he waited. And he didn't have to wait long. 20 minutes later, the penthouse lights flickered back on her. She had gone inside. Ethan's pulse quickened. She was after something important. Moving quietly, he stepped out of the car, climbed back up to the apartment and walked down the hallway with silent footsteps. When he reached the office door, he saw it slightly open. Olivia was inside. She stood by his desk, a stack of papers, spread out before her, flipping through them rapidly. A surge of adrenaline coursed through Ethan's veins. He stayed there, watching, waiting, until suddenly she stopped. She was holding a specific document. And then, almost imperceptibly, she brought a hand to her lips, as if trying to process something difficult. Ethan's brow furrowed. What did she find? Before he could take another step, Olivia's head snapped up. She felt his presence. Her eyes flickered with alarm, but this time he saw something more. It wasn't just surprise, it was fear. The silence between them was suffocating. Olivia clutched the paper so tightly that her fingers had turned white. "What did you find?" Ethan asked, his voice steady, but the weight of the moment pressing against him. She didn't answer. He took a step forward. She stepped back. That irritated him. "Olivia, tell me what you found." She closed her eyes for a brief moment, as if trying to steady her breath. When she opened them again, her voice was barely a whisper. "You don't remember, do you?" Ethan frowned. "Remember what?" She let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Of course you don't. A man like you never remembers the things he destroys along the way." A shiver ran down Ethan's spine. There was something here, something big, and for the first time, he wasn't sure he was ready to hear it. That night was one of the longest of Ethan's life. Olivia said nothing else. She simply left the office, taking that document with her, and locked herself in the bedroom. Ethan stayed behind, alone with his own shadows. He opened drawers, flipped through files, searching for whatever had caused that reaction in her. But he found nothing, or maybe he didn't know what he was looking for, until at the bottom of an old drawer he found a faded envelope. When he opened it, his blood ran cold. It was a contract, an old business deal, and the name written beneath his own was Olivia's last name. His eyes widened, his breath hitched. This was it. This was what she wanted. He had destroyed something that belonged to her family. But what exactly? And more importantly, was this revenge? Ethan felt the weight of the answer before he even heard it, because now he knew. This was never about marriage. It was always about something much bigger. And Olivia. Olivia had never been playing to lose. The contract trembled in Ethan's hands. He held it as if it were a cursed artifact, a piece of his own history that until that moment he hadn't even known existed. But now it all made sense. Every distant look from Olivia, every time she seemed to be waiting for something, every small hesitation at just the right moments. She had entered this marriage for a reason, and it wasn't for the money, it was for revenge. Ethan stayed awake the rest of the night. He combed through every detail of the document, trying to understand the full weight of it. The name on the signature, Miguel Lancaster. Ethan's mind spun. He knew that name. Not from memory, but because he had gone through so many contracts, so many acquisitions, so many cold, impersonal mergers, that he had never paid attention to the casualties of his decisions. But now he needed to remember. He grabbed his phone and called one of his lawyers, not caring about the time. "I need you to send me the acquisition records for Lancaster and Sons. A deal closed a few years ago." There was a pause on the other end. "Ethan, are you sure?" "What do you mean?" The lawyer sighed. "That acquisition was one of the most controversial. There was a lawsuit, do you remember? The owner of the company claimed you deceived him, that you manipulated the contracts to take everything. But in the end, the court ruled in your favor, as always." Ethan felt his stomach tighten. And what happened to that man? The silence. On the other end was an answer he didn't want to hear. "Ethan, he died a year later. Suicide." Ethan closed his eyes, the weight of the revelation hitting him like a blow. Olivia wasn't just an unlikely adversary. She was the daughter of the man he had destroyed. The next morning, Ethan walked into the kitchen, the weight of his sleepless night pressing on his shoulders. Olivia was already there. She drank her coffee as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't discovered the night before that he was the man who had ruined her family. He stood there for a moment, watching her. How could she be this calm? How had she spent all this time living under the same roof as him without breaking? Or maybe she had always known that. At some point he would figure it out. Ethan pulled out a chair and sat at the table, his eyes fixed on her. "Your maiden name was Lancaster, wasn't it?" She lifted her gaze slowly. There was no shock, no surprise, only calculated silence. She set her coffee cup down on the table and intertwined her fingers on her lap. "Took you longer than I expected." Her words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. "You knew I'd find out." "Of course." Her voice was steady. "But I wanted to see how long it would take for you to realize that your life of power has consequences." Ethan clenched his jaw. "This marriage, was it your plan from the start?" Olivia tilted her head slightly. "I simply took advantage of an opportunity. When Ryan made the bet, I realized I could get close enough to see if you even had a conscience about what you'd done." He let out a quiet, disbelieving laugh. "And what did you find out?" Olivia didn't look away. "That you don't remember." He had no argument against that. Until last night, he hadn't even known who Miguel Lancaster was. And now, sitting across from the daughter of the man he had destroyed, he realized just how cold he had been. "You wanted revenge?" he asked, his voice low. She didn't answer immediately. She picked up her coffee, took a slow sip, and then murmured, "I wanted you to know what it feels like to lose something you think you control." Ethan frowned. "And did you?" She finally smiled. "Not yet." A shiver ran down Ethan's spine. Because, for the first time, something dawned on him. Olivia wasn't finished. The game wasn't over, and he had no idea what she was still holding back. Ethan had never felt out of control. Never. But now, sitting across from Olivia, feeling the weight of the name Lancaster between them, he realized he was lost in a game he was never meant to win. And she knew it. The gleam in Olivia's eyes wasn't just victory, it was patience. the kind of patience that comes from waiting for this moment for a long, long time. So, he crossed his arms, leaning over the table, trying to maintain his composure. If the game isn't over yet, what exactly are you still waiting for? She slowly turned her coffee cup between her fingers, her lips curving into a subtle smile. You'll find out. Ethan spent the rest of the day unable to focus on anything. He didn't answer emails, didn't return calls. For the first time in his life, his mind wasn't on business, it was on her. He knew Olivia didn't want money, didn't want status. She wanted him to feel. But feel what? He had never cared. About the people he destroyed along the way. Companies were numbers, people were obstacles. But suddenly, Miguel Lancaster wasn't just a name on an old contract. He was a man who had lost everything. And his daughter, now his wife, was here to remind him of it every second. But what did she really want? As night fell, Ethan found Olivia on the balcony again. She always seemed to return to that same spot, as if it were her refuge. This time, he didn't watch from a distance. He walked up beside her. You never told me about him. She didn't answer immediately. She simply gazed at the city lights. Because you never asked. Ethan felt the weight of those words settle on him. He could have said he didn't know, could have argued that all he did was make a business deal, but it would have been a lie. He knew his methods were ruthless. And now, for the first time, he was looking into the eyes of someone who had lived through the consequences. What was he like? He asked quietly. Olivia slowly turned to face him. Ethan had never seen that look in her eyes before. It was filled with years of pain, something unbreakable. And yet, there was something else there, something he couldn't quite place. My father was a good man, she said, her voice steady but soft. He built an honest business from nothing. He never wanted to be a mogul. He just wanted something to leave behind for me. Ethan felt a sharp pang in his chest. He had never wanted to leave anything behind for anyone, had never cared about sentimental legacies, only money. Olivia turned away, inhaling deeply. When he realized you had deceived him, he tried to fight, but you had everything planned, didn't you? Ethan didn't respond, because she was right. He had done what he always did. Created a contract that seemed fair, but in the end, drained everything from the other party. In the end, he lost everything. The company, the money, his pride. She closed her eyes for a moment before finishing. And then, one day, he just gave up. Ethan swallowed hard. He knew this story, had seen it happen before, but he had never had to face the consequences up close. And now they were standing right in front of him. The silence between them stretched for what felt like hours. Then finally, Olivia turned fully to him, her eyes burning with something Ethan had never seen before. You want to know what I've been waiting for? He nodded slowly. She stepped closer, her voice low but razor sharp. I'm waiting for you, to know what it feels like to lose. A chill ran down Ethan's spine, because for the first time he realized something he had never considered before. He could lose, but lose what? The game, the money, or something much deeper? Something he hadn't even known he was capable of valuing. Olivia's gaze cut through him. But the real question is, she continued, will you realize it before it's too late? Ethan held his breath, because now he understood. She wasn't after revenge. She was waiting for him to figure it out. On his own, to understand the pain he had caused. And if he didn't, maybe Olivia would walk away. Maybe this was checkmate. Ethan spent the next few days carrying an unfamiliar weight in his chest. He had never been a sentimental man, never looked back with regret. His life had been built on calculated decisions, surgical cuts that benefited him and no one else. But now he saw the ghosts of what he had left behind. Olivia had spent months waiting for this moment. She didn't just want revenge, she wanted him to feel. And for the first time, Ethan felt. That night, the silence between them was heavier than ever. They sat at the dining table, untouched food growing cold on their plates. Olivia traced the rim of her wineglass with her fingertips, while Ethan kept his gaze fixed on her. He needed to say something. But what? How could someone like him ask for forgiveness for something he had never even cared to remember? Finally, Olivia broke the silence. "Are you afraid, Ethan?" He frowned. "Afraid of what?" She lifted her eyes, and whatever he saw in them sent a chill up his spine. "Afraid of being forgotten." Ethan's heart pounded. "What are you trying to say?" She gave him a small, humorless smile. "You've spent your entire life making sure your name would be remembered. Your companies, your deals, your empire, all of it exists because you're terrified of being irrelevant." Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but the words never came, because somehow Olivia was right. He had never had a family, never had real connections. His name only had value because it was tied to power. But what if, one day, that wasn't enough? What if everything collapsed? What would be left of him? "You're analyzing me like I'm some kind of project," he murmured. Olivia tilted her head slightly. "Maybe you are." Ethan let out a low chuckle, but there was no humor in it. He felt like he was falling into a void, one he might not be able to climb out of. Later that night, he went into his office. He sank into his leather chair and stared at the bookshelves lined with contracts, reports, and trophies of achievements that no longer seemed so important. He picked up the old Lancaster and Sons contract. His eyes skimmed over the clauses, the terms he had personally adjusted to ensure he came out on top. And then, at the bottom of the page, he saw the signature, Miguel Lancaster. It had once been just another name to him, one that had passed through his hands without a second thought. But now he saw something different. Now he saw a man who, at the end of his life, had signed that contract without knowing he was sealing his own downfall. Ethan closed his eyes, feeling something he had never felt before. Guilt. He didn't sleep that night. The weight of his conscience crushed him in a way nothing ever had. By morning, he found Olivia in the living room, packing a suitcase. His heart stopped. "What are you doing?" She didn't look at him right away. She just zipped up the bag and set it beside the couch. "Leaving." The words hit him like a blow. "You're giving up?" She finally met his eyes. "You think I did all of this to win, Ethan?" He swallowed hard. "I don't know what to think anymore." Olivia sighed, shaking her head. "I've given you all the answers. Now it's up to you." She grabbed the suitcase and started toward the door. Ethan's entire body tensed. Everything inside him screamed to stop her, but then he realized something. This wasn't a battle he could win. If he wanted Olivia to stay, he had to change. Not for her, but for himself, and maybe he was already out of time. She opened the door and hesitated for a brief moment, but then, without looking back, she walked out. And for the first time in his life, Ethan knew what it felt like to lose something that truly mattered. The door closed, and Ethan stood there, motionless. The sound of the lock clicking echoed through the silent apartment, marking the end of something he couldn't quite define. Olivia was gone, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do. The days that followed were a blur. Ethan buried himself in work, meetings, contracts, mergers. He tried to drown out every thought that could lead him back to that morning, but nothing worked. Olivia's absence was a void that refused to be filled, and that infuriated him. He had never needed anyone, so why now? Why did it feel like he had lost something he never even knew he wanted? One night he came home and noticed something he had never truly seen before. The apartment was silent, but it wasn't the peaceful silence of someone who enjoyed solitude. It was the silence of an empty place. Ethan walked through the rooms as if expecting to see her there, sitting on the balcony with a cup of tea or curled up on the couch, lost in a book, but there was nothing, no trace of her. Except for one thing, a single folder left on the dining table. His brows furrowed as he stepped closer. When he opened it, he immediately recognized the documents. Lancaster and Sons records. And on top of them, a short note, written in Olivia's precise, elegant handwriting. "Now you know. What are you going to do about it?" Ethan felt his chest tighten. She hadn't just left him behind. She had given him a choice. But could he do the right thing, or was he still the same man who had destroyed her father? The next morning, he didn't go to the office. Instead, he picked up the phone and made a series of calls. He contacted lawyers, reviewed contracts, analyzed every detail of the Lancaster and Sons acquisition, and for the first time, he saw the destruction he had truly caused. He had never cared before. But now, every line of that contract screamed at him. Every clause felt like a punch to the chest. Every legal loophole he had used to benefit himself was proof of how little he had considered the faces of the people he had ruined. Miguel Lancaster hadn't just lost a company. He had lost a legacy, a life, and his daughter, had carried that pain straight to him. But what did she expect him to do now? Over the next few days, Ethan worked in silence. Little by little, he started to reverse the damage. It wasn't simple. It wasn't something he could fix with a single check. He tracked down former employees who had been fired without warning. He found former partners who had lost everything and never recovered. And then he discovered something even worse. The company he had taken over, absorbed into the empire he had built, had been dismantled piece by piece. He hadn't just bought it, he had erased it, as if Miguel Lancaster had never existed. And now, Ethan had to find a way to fix what he had destroyed. He didn't try calling Olivia, not because he didn't want to see her, but because he knew words wouldn't be enough. She wouldn't come back because he asked. She would only come back if she saw real change, and that was what he needed to prove. A month passed. Ethan was sitting in his office when he received an email from one of the lawyers he had hired to track down what was left of Lancaster and Sons. The subject line was simple: "One last chance," and inside, a single address. His heart pounded. He knew what this meant. The next day, Ethan drove to the location. It was an old industrial building, abandoned. The last physical remnant of what had once been her family's company. He stepped out of the car and walked toward the rusted gates, and then he saw a silhouette standing there, waiting for him. Olivia. His chest tightened at the sight of her, but there was no smile on her face. Her expression was serious, assessing him. She wanted to see if he was truly a different man, and Ethan knew this was his last chance, because this time it wasn't a game anymore. This was real, and if he failed, he would lose Olivia forever. Here is the translation of Chapter 15. The last move, preserving the emotional depth and tension of the original. Ethan wasn't exactly sure what he expected when he found Olivia standing in front of the building that once belonged to her father. Maybe a look of relief, maybe anger, but what he found was something far worse: indifference. She regarded him as if she already knew he would come, but not because she was expecting anything. It was as if she were giving him one final chance to say something that truly mattered. And Ethan couldn't afford to waste it. He took a deep breath and stepped toward her, but Olivia remained still. "I've reopened the Lancaster and Sons case," he said, his voice firm yet devoid of arrogance. For the first time, he wasn't speaking. As a businessman, he wasn't trying to win. He was simply someone who wanted to make things right. Olivia crossed her arms, her eyes sharp. "And what does that change?" Ethan held his breath. It means I'm giving everything back. She blinked. Slowly. Everything. Yes, he nodded. All the company's remaining assets, compensation for the laid-off employees, the patents your father created, everything. She was silent for a long moment. Then her expression finally changed. It wasn't happiness, nor was it satisfied. Revenge. It was surprise. Why? Her voice was low, carrying a weight Ethan had never heard before. Ethan sighed. Because I finally understood. She said nothing, only waited. Then he continued. All my life, I believed power was about control, about winning. He lowered his head, staring at the floor before looking back at her. But with you, I lost control. Olivia remained silent, yet Ethan saw something shift in her gaze. I lost control, Olivia, he repeated, his voice nearly a whisper. And it's the best thing that's ever happened to me. A heavy silence fell between them. She blinked several times, as if processing his words. Then slowly, she shook her head. That doesn't change what happened. I know. He nodded. And I don't expect it to. Olivia's eyes glimmered, and Ethan realized something was there. It wasn't just pain or anger. It was hope, and that was enough. So now, she asked, her voice almost hesitant. Ethan stepped closer. Now, the choice is yours. She studied him for a long moment, then slowly sighed. Have you really changed? Ethan swallowed hard. I'm changing. Olivia scrutinized his face for several seconds, searching for any sign of deceit. But there was none. Ethan, the man who always controlled everything, now stood completely exposed. Finally, Olivia smiled, a small smile, but a real one. And Ethan knew that perhaps this was his first true victory, not over her, but over himself. Months later, the new headquarters of Lancaster & Sons was ready, not as a corporate empire, but as a legacy. Ethan watched from the audience as Olivia delivered the re-inauguration speech. She spoke with pride, with strength, and above all, with the certainty that she had overcome her greatest battle. Ethan didn't need to go on stage. He didn't need any accolades. For the first time in his life, he knew that simply being, there was enough. When the event ended, Olivia approached him. She looked into his eyes with something different this time. Do you want to know the answer to your question? He raised an eyebrow. What question? She smiled. The one I was waiting for. Ethan's heart raced. Olivia stepped closer and whispered, I was waiting for you to become a man worthy of me. Then, unhurriedly, she took his hand. Ethan smiled, because for the first time, he finally understood what it truly meant to win. What did you think of this story? Give it a rating from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very important to us. If you made it this far, comment chocolate. Only those who watched until the end will understand your message. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe. For more inspiring stories, leave a like and share it with someone you care about.